Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. My name is James Breen, and I am autistic. In honor of Autism Awareness Month, which is April, I have decided to finally do something I've wanted to do for quite some time, which is put out some educational material on autism spectrum disorder. This is going to be a four-part series. In part one, I'm going to focus on education awareness, really sticking to what is autism spectrum disorder. Part two is going to focus on understanding. I'm going to let you walk a mile in my shoes and hopefully try and convey to you what it's like to be autistic. I'm a size 10. I hope that works for everyone. And part three and part four are going to focus on a call to action and allyship. Really, what changes can you make and what changes can you help others make to be a better, ally to the ASD community. So with that, we'll dive right in. So I want to start with, what we do know. And so just to quickly set the scene here, the first autism diagnosis, excuse my cat, the first autism diagnosis was 1943, and it was originally believed to be a psychiatric condition, a mental illness. And in the last 80 years, we've debunked a tremendous amount of the myths we learned along the way. And so I want to start with really the ground level. And the ground level is autism is a fundamental rewiring of the brain. It's just a differently developed brain. There's nothing curable. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a different brain. And the easiest example of this is the prefrontal cortex versus the amygdala. So in a neurotypical brain, a normal brain, if you see a facial feature on someone, so if someone frowns, if they laugh, if they cry, the amygdala in a neurotypical brain is what kicks in. And it intuitively responds emotionally. And, that's just an intuitive response. The autistic brain actually triggers the prefrontal cortex, which is our judgment and planning section of the brain. And we logically determine what emotion that person is experiencing. And so we still get to that well of what is an appropriate empathetic response, but it's a fundamentally different way of reaching that. The neurotypical is that intuitive, and the neurodivergent, that autistic brain, is judgmentally determining, almost like a machine learning code. And so as I noted, autism is a developmental disability. It begins during early development. It's prenatal or up to age 3. And by that time, the brain as that brain is developing in a child, it fully reaches that point where it has either gone the neurotypical or the neurodivergent route. CDC data from 2020 found that autism impacts 1 in 44 children. Now, anyone who looks at that and looks at a trending analysis, I know we really value data in this community. Anyone who looks at that is going to say, whoa, 1 in 44 is way, way, way more than it used to be. And while technically side by side that's true, it's very misleading. And there's two reasons there's more. One is we are better at identifying and providing resources to notice autism spectrum disorder than we ever have been. And so there's not necessarily more autistics, we're just actually noticing it and counting them. And the other piece of that is as autism spectrum disorder continues to expand in our understanding of what it is and encompass perhaps a broader area of the population than perhaps it did before, we are including more individuals than we used to. And so the apples to apples comparison, or excuse me, so it is not an apples to apples comparison. Now, let's spend a little time on what autism is not. And autism is not caused by poor parenting, trauma, abuse, or neglect. This was conclusively debunked in the 60s and 70s, and all evidence in the last 50 years has continued to show that this is the case. And then lastly, I can't emphasize this one enough for both personal reasons and community science. Autism is not a mental illness. It's not an emotional illness. It's a fundamental rewiring of the brain. It is a developmental disability. We don't need a cure. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit more about what autism spectrum disorder is today. So currently the diagnostic manual for it is through a 2013 publication by the American Psychiatric Association called the DSM-5. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in 2013, they lumped together a number of previously individual diagnoses into what is now known as autism spectrum disorder. And they lumped these together for a few good reasons. And those few good reasons were these. All of these categories that now are known as autism spectrum disorder have these 5 pieces of it: social impediments, communication difficulties, intense focus/interests, sensitivities, and routine and repetition. And so I'm not going to drain the slide. I'm actually going to talk about these in detail over the next few slides and break them out individually. But what I want to focus on here is just a brief disclaimer. There are a number of pie charts, matrices that any of you who are involved in the community, or if you do your own research, you may see. There's a lot of versions that people like to put together to really encompass what flows through autism spectrum disorder. And I'm going to go so far as to say none of them are wrong. Like, there is a tremendous amount of variation and perspective and nuance and judgment that the scientific community puts into this, and on top of that, that the autistic community puts into it. So you get a interesting melding of perspectives on this. So the 5 I'm going to share with you are what I feel are the most cogent and shareable examples to help understand what underlies the condition. There's other components to it that others perceive. These are the ones I want to walk you through. So with that, I want to start with social impediments. And so I'll read this off just because I think all of these are pretty valuable, but social impediments can range from difficulties with emotions, making friends, sharing interests, and even a complete disinterest in other people. And I promise you, I feel that one from time to time, but I am far more extroverted than a pretty substantial majority of most on the spectrum. Poor understanding of personal boundaries on the left side, this can be physical or emotional. I really struggle with this one. So if I meet someone, first day, new coworker, we're best friends. That's how I see it. Once I meet them and talk to them, I don't have personal boundaries. I mean, I had to learn the behavior that people don't like to be hugged the day you meet them if they haven't known you before. They aren't comfortable talking about personal matters because it's private, or they just met you. I struggle with those personal boundaries. So trust me, that's a real thing. And difficulty expressing emotions. This one's really interesting because one of the most common traits that's associated with autism spectrum disorder in general are meltdowns. Everyone's heard of the autistic meltdown, the kid, crying in the grocery aisle, whatever it is. And what's interesting about it is most of it stems, at least in my experience, most of it stems from an inability to release emotions in a controlled and acceptable fashion. It's this difficulty expressing emotions, discussing them, and think of it like a release valve. It's just kind of letting it out bit by bit. A conversation with a friend, sitting down to a calm lunch. If we can't release it, eventually it overflows, and that's what triggers that meltdown. Communication difficulties. This one is my personal favorite, and I say that with a hint of satire. Reading the room. This is my least favorite phrase in existence, and it's because I can't do it. If I walk into a room and there's a vibe, I cannot discern the vibe. I don't recognize it. I don't see it. I don't process it. What is intuitive to any neurotypical who walks into a room, because their amygdala picks that up. I walk into the room, and unless I actually intentionally start scanning and trying to deduce the emotion of every person on their face, it's simply not an efficient processing. So I just don't do it. And it gets me into trouble, which brings us to that bottom left. You'll see facetious. If the vibe in the room is negative, it's down, it's upset for whatever reason, I'm going to walk into that, not recognize it. And I might crack a joke about, the Oscars and, how Chris Rock's feeling right now, not recognizing that the mood in the room is really not up for that. The other thing is the understanding and use of gestures. You will notice I'm fidgeting a lot. It's very, very difficult for me to stand still. I can sit still in a chair, I can behave, but when I talk, I need to move. And so a lot of people who've worked with me over Zoom for a while, or Teams for that matter, you'll notice that I might, drop my video. I just pace around my desk. I need to move. And so I'm going to try to keep my fidgeting to a minimum to not distract you folks too much. No promises. Words and tones may not match. So this was a glass shattering moment for me actually about 2 or 3 years ago. I was giving a presentation, and it was through a training program. So I had a friend that I worked with who video recorded the whole thing and walked through it with me. And he said, I really liked your jokes, but I thought it was a little dry. And I was like, and I knew what joke he was talking about. We went and rewatched the recording, and I watched what I knew to be a very funny joke that I meant sincerely. It was a great experience, and it was really funny. And I watched myself deliver it in the most flat, monotone voice ever. And it just completely changed the way I perceived that I wasn't putting the right tone to match the intent I was going for. And so it was a really interesting experience. And I still struggle with it, but I'm now a little more aware of it at least. Special interests. So hyperfixation and special interests, this is a pretty commonly covered one in media. And so you'll mean whether it's trains, whether it's engineering, whether it's, Big Bang Theory covering, some of this to some extent. I'll say folks are generally pretty familiar with the concept, but what I think I really want to focus on is if you read the wording in the center of the screen, intense and specific interests, sure, we were already there, sometimes to the exclusion of other tasks or needs. And what this means is, so if you think about Maslow's priorities, hierarchy of needs, now imagine that woodworking made its way onto that list. Imagine that movie watching made its way onto that list. Imagine that playing chess made its way onto that hierarchy. People put shelter as their number one, food, water number two. I might screw these up. Someone fact check me on this. But imagine a random productive interest, again, woodworking, chess, movie watching, gets slotted in there. That's how important a special interest is to an autistic individual that's fixated on it. It's not, oh, we really want to do it and you just need to cave to our desires. It is literally on our hierarchy of needs. We need to do this and engage with it. And so it can become a very interesting challenge depending on what the fixation is. I promise you, we don't choose them. It can be very interesting in how difficult it is for us to blend that fixation into society. Some of them are very productive. If woodworking is that fixation, some of them become the most amazing crafters. And that's something society cherishes. Whereas someone who plays chess, unless they go on to play at a professional level, which is not a very wide open scene, it can be very difficult to find a way to make that quote unquote productive. And now movie watching, well, where do you fit that in? And so some of the autistic traits don't blend well with neurotypical society. And so it's not that the person isn't, trying to do something, it's that their natural focus and gifts don't function well in that. And so the last thing to notice is usually these are focused on how things work versus how society functions. I mean, think of it almost like, the engineer that'd rather lock themselves in their cubicle and just, code all day or design something. It tends to not be focused on societal functions like, frankly, politics. Sensitivities. This is another generally understood one. I don't want to pretend how well, but the focus here is it's not just high sensitivity, but also high or low sensitivity to environmental factors. This includes, sound, light, temperatures, physical sensations. I'll throw smell in there as well. I have a very sensitive sense of smell. Please don't heat fish in a microwave in the office ever. I promise you that while everyone finds that annoying, I find it truly painful. I will find you. Please don't do it. This isn't even autistic advice. This is just life advice. Don't do it to anyone ever. It's an absolute tragedy. And with that, let's segue right into neon lights and get away from the fish. I recently discovered this one, actually about 2 months ago. I discovered that bright neon lights give me physical nausea. And I was able to reproduce this because for science, we have to be able to reproduce the effects. And I was able to reproduce it, and it's true, a frequency pattern, almost like a rainbow of neon lights, is extremely discomforting for me. I actually had to walk away from my computer because it was so bad. Pants buttons. Those of you with kids, some of you may even have picked this out. Generally the button on that, some kids get a rash to nickel when they're growing up. For me, it wasn't even just a rash. Like the physical sensation of that metal on my skin is incredibly irritating for me. It's just, I can't stand the feel of metal on my flesh. It's a very, very bizarre sensation. And so think of it, much expanded from any, discomfort you may have experienced with some of your children. It's not pleasant. And then lastly, sound frequencies. For this one, this can be a lot of things. This can be loud noises. It's generally not just loudness, but complexity. So think about being at a happy hour, tons of loud and complex voices. Maybe there's a band playing. All of that sound coming in is very hard to distribute and disseminate. And then to try to hear someone else across the table, the conflicting nature of all those sounds is very, very difficult for a lot of autistics. I know it is very difficult for me. And then lastly, on this list of the 5 that I've pulled out here is routine and repetition. And so you'll notice the center box here is that individuals with autism may prefer sameness and strictly follow routines or ritualized patterns. And it's this need for structure. And so, and I've highlighted that in a couple places. Structure, scheduling, canceled or spontaneous plans. It's not structure. Surprises. I hate surprises because they change what I thought my day was going to be. And so I have to work very hard to create a flexible structure. And really what that means is my structure is not flexible. I create a structure that is wide enough so that the guardrails have room for flexibility. And it took me many, many, many years to really navigate that. And of course, still, something come out of left field and change that structure. For example, when COVID hit, I lost my commute. And let me be clear, before people start rioting on me, I have no concerns about losing the commute as a function. But what I lost was my structure, my set piece of time where I knew where I was driving, I knew what audiobook I was listening to, I knew where I was parking, and that was my transition time before I began work. And so when COVID started, I was really struggling, listless, trying to figure out when my day started. And so my compensation is I had to, create a new structure, a new commute, if you will. And I began a morning walk with a cup of coffee, which I vastly prefer to the commute. But the point is I needed that structure. So the last thing I want to focus on here, let me go ahead and move this video for you. The last thing I want to focus on here is the nature of autism spectrum disorder when it comes to individuals. Autism spectrum disorder is a highly individualized condition. If you've met one person that's autistic, then you've met one person that's autistic. The commonalities from a visual perspective are simply not obvious. So you look at these five pieces I've talked about, these 5 pieces on this pie chart that break it up. These are not simple. They're not always the same size. And if you look at this smaller section here with hypothetical autistic individuals, one person may have a very intense special interest, but actually doesn't really have much in the way of communication difficulties. You may see someone with no special interest fixation whatsoever, but still struggle with communication, with sensitivity, and a little bit of social impediment, routine repetition. And now for those of you who are data folks, math, you can quickly see the number of permutations here, the number of variations are tremendous with the level of difference here. And that doesn't even account for just general personality. We are people. This is simply something that gets overlaid on top of us that, challenges the way we function in a neurotypical society. So I really, really want to emphasize this one. It's really important to appreciate how human this is. We're not machines where we can give you a playbook and tell you, hey, this is how it works. Many of us don't fully understand how it all works for us because it is difficult. I mean, some conditions, sensitivities we've never been exposed to, and we find out in the moment. And it's like getting punched in the face. Like the sound of if you've ever dropped a frying pan before and listened to it ring around on the floor. That happened to me about 6 months ago. First time I'd ever heard it. It was physical agony. Not a fun experience. And so I mean, I'm circling the drain a little bit here. The point is very individualized experience. And the whole point here is to try to provide some semblance of information to ascribe judgment and understanding around some of the traits and that are going to follow around an autistic individual. And that transitions pretty well into what I want to talk about next time. So what's next? So first of all, thank you for getting this far. And next Monday, what I want to drop is another presentation similar to this one, a little more focused on more free form. And it's really going to be about understanding and, walking that mile in my shoes and walking through a lot more of my personal experience in the autistic world, so to speak. And that's going to include my childhood, education. It's going to include, professional work, including corporate America. It's going to include, the volunteer work I do. It's going to include every aspect of my life to really try and give that perspective as best as I can of what it is like. And then, like I said, part 3 and part 4 will focus on a call to action and allyship. So again, thank you so much for making it this far. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next time.